If you live in a modern city, whether it is New York, Tokyo, or London, you have likely never experienced true, absolute darkness. Even in the middle of the night, if you turn off every single lamp in your house, your bedroom is still softly illuminated. There is the piercing blue glow of a phone charger on the nightstand, the harsh digital numbers of a microwave in the kitchen, the orange bleed of a sodium street lamp filtering through the blinds, and the ambient hazy glow of millions of artificial lights bouncing off the low-hanging clouds above the city.
We live in a world of eternal, manufactured twilight. But occasionally, a massive storm, a blown transformer, or a cascading grid failure will trigger a total blackout. And when the power grid fails, something primal and deeply unsettling happens. Within seconds of the lights cutting out, the entire psychological atmosphere of the city changes. The sudden, absolute blackness triggers an ancient biological anxiety embedded deep in our DNA. We frantically reach for our phones to activate the flashlights.
We feel a deep, unsettling vulnerability until the lights finally flicker back on and the hum of the refrigerator returns. What if that terrifying, vulnerable feeling of absolute blackness wasn't an emergency? What if, for 99.9% of human history, that was simply what happened every single day when the sun dipped below the horizon? What if the most violent, dangerous, and physically exhausting industries on the planet existed solely to push back the dark for just a few hours? This is the brutal, explosive, and world-altering engineering history of how humanity finally murdered the night, and how the simple act of flipping a switch required the near extinction of a species, the poisoning of our own homes, and the literal rewiring of human biology. To understand the magnitude of what modern electricity accomplished, you have to place yourself in a major European metropolis in the middle of the 17th or 18th century. When the sun set over a city like London or Paris, the city did not slowly transition into a vibrant, romantic nightlife. It simply ceased to function. The streets plunged into an abyss of total, suffocating darkness. There were no municipal streetlights. The concept of the night was entirely different than it is today. In the pre-industrial era, the night did not belong to honest people. It belonged to the supernatural, and it belonged to the criminal. When the sun went down, churches would ring the couvre-feu bell, a French term meaning cover the fire, which is the origin of the modern word curfew.
This was a literal instruction to bury your hearth fires to prevent the wooden city from burning down, but it was also a psychological signal. The day is over. Lock your doors. If you had to travel from a tavern or a theater back to your home, you were walking blind through a labyrinth of uneven cobblestones, open sewers, and incredibly narrow, winding alleys. Because the darkness was absolute, the streets were unimaginably dangerous.
In the early 18th century, London was terrorized by gangs of wealthy, aristocratic young men known as the Mohawks, who used the pitch-black streets to assault pedestrians, overturn carriages, and brutally beat members of the night watch simply for their own amusement. To navigate this blackness, wealthy pedestrians had to hire link boys. These were impoverished, often homeless children who stood outside theaters, brothels, and taverns holding crude torches known as links made of twisted rope coated in highly flammable pitch and tar.
For a small fee of a halfpenny, a link boy would walk a few paces ahead of you, carrying the flaming, smoking torch to light your path home. But hiring a link boy was a massive, sometimes deadly gamble. These children lived in extreme poverty, surviving on the fringes of society, and many were affiliated with the city's ruthless street gangs. A common tactic was for a link boy to accept a wealthy, drunken client, lead them away from the main thoroughfares, and deliberately guide them into a dead-end, pitch-black alley.
Once there, the boy would suddenly extinguish his torch, plunging the victim into total darkness. Seconds later, the boy's accomplices would emerge from the shadows, beat the blind, disoriented victim with clubs, strip them of their valuables, and leave them bleeding in the dirt. The darkness was not just an inconvenience, it was a physical, pervasive threat. Early attempts by the government to force citizens to hang lanterns outside their homes were widely ignored because the oil and candles were too expensive to waste on strangers.
If you made it inside your home safely, the situation was barely better. Light was an extreme luxury item. The working class and the poor relied on tallow candles. These were made from rendered animal fat, usually from the slaughtered carcasses of cows or sheep. Tallow candles were cheap to produce, but they were absolutely awful to use. They burned with a dim, flickering, smoky yellow flame that coated the walls and ceilings of a home in black, greasy soot. And because they were literally made of rotting animal fat, they smelled horrific, like a burning slaughterhouse.
They also melted rapidly in the summer heat and were frequently eaten by rats. If you wanted clean, bright light to read a book, write a letter, or entertain guests, you had to pay for it in blood. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the absolute premium standard for lighting the homes of the global elite was a miraculous substance called spermaceti. Spermaceti was a waxy, liquid substance that produced a brilliant, steady, odorless, and smokeless white flame. It was the greatest illuminant the world had ever seen.
The unit of measurement we still use today to measure the brightness of a light bulb, candle power, was originally based on the exact amount of light produced by a single, perfectly crafted spermaceti candle. But spermaceti could only be found in one place on Earth, inside the massive, block-shaped head cavity of the sperm whale. To light the drawing rooms of London, Paris, and New York, an unimaginably brutal global industry was born. Fleets of heavy wooden ships, manned by thousands of desperate sailors, sailed out of island ports like Nantucket, Massachusetts.
These men spent 3 to 4 years at a time navigating the most dangerous, uncharted oceans on the planet, specifically to hunt the largest toothed predator on Earth. The process of acquiring this light was a waking nightmare of industrial violence. When a whale was harpooned and killed after a brutal, hours-long struggle, the carcass was lashed to the side of the ship. The sailors would cut a massive hole directly into the head cavity of the dead Leviathan. Men would strip down and literally lower themselves waist-deep into the skull of the whale, standing in a pool of blood and tissue, using buckets to bail out the precious liquid spermaceti wax. Then came the try-works. These were massive brick furnaces built directly onto the wooden deck of the whaling ship, containing gigantic cast-iron cauldrons. The sailors would peel the thick blubber off the whale, chop it into blocks, and boil it down in the try-works to extract the lower-grade whale oil. The ships became floating slaughterhouses, enveloped in a thick, rancid black smoke that could be seen for miles. To keep the fires burning beneath the cauldrons, the sailors used the crispy, fried remnants of the whale's own flesh as fuel. It was an incredibly dangerous profession. Whale ships were routinely destroyed by storms, crushed by ice, or, in the most terrifying instances, sunk by the very animals they were hunting. In 1820, the Nantucket whale ship Essex was repeatedly rammed and sunk in the middle of the Pacific Ocean by a massive, enraged sperm whale.
The crew was forced into tiny lifeboats, floating thousands of miles from land. To survive the months-long ordeal, the starving sailors were eventually forced to draw lots, murder their own crewmates, and engage in cannibalism. This horrific event became the direct historical inspiration for Herman Melville's masterpiece, Moby Dick.
The sheer violence, the thousands of sailors who drowned or were crushed, the cannibalism, and the near extinction of an entire species of highly intelligent marine mammals, all of it was done, fundamentally, so that human beings could read a book after 7 p.m. without smelling burning beef fat. But as the Industrial Revolution exploded across Europe and America, cities needed more light than the oceans could possibly provide. Factories needed to run 24 hours a day to maximize profits. The textile mills couldn't operate in the dark.
The solution engineers devised was brilliant, but it turned the cities into ticking time bombs. Welcome to the Victorian era and the invention of town gas. In the late 1700s, a Scottish engineer named William Murdoch discovered that if you baked coal in a massive oxygen-starved oven, it wouldn't burn to ash. Instead, it would release a highly flammable, invisible gas. In 1807, a promotional demonstration of this technology was organized in London, and Pall Mall became the first street in the history of the world to be illuminated by public gas lamps.
Engineers realized they could mass produce this. They built massive gas works in the industrial centers of cities. These facilities were hellish environments. Desperate laborers, known as stokers or gasmen, worked shirtless in unbearable heat, shoveling tons of raw coal into glowing iron retorts to bake the gas out of the rock. The gasworks captured this coal gas and pumped it through thousands of miles of crude underground iron pipes directly into street lamps and the homes of the middle and upper classes. Gaslighting completely transformed the physical and social geography of the city.
For the first time, major thoroughfares were illuminated at night. The terrifying darkness was pushed back. The criminal link boys disappeared. The vibrant nightlife we associate with modern cities, late-night restaurants, evening theater performances, the ability to walk safely after dark, was born under the gentle, hissing sound of the gas lamp. But town gas was a terrifying, deeply flawed technology. Unlike modern natural gas, which is heavily refined, purified, and rigorously controlled, Victorian coal gas was raw and highly toxic.
It contained lethal amounts of carbon monoxide and hydrogen sulfide. It smelled strongly of rotten eggs and sulfur. Because the underground pipes were poorly manufactured, sealed with crude materials, and laid in a massive hurry by competing companies, they fractured constantly. Gas leaked into the soil, killing the roots of the trees lining the streets. It leaked through the cobblestones, and it leaked through the floorboards of houses. Inside the home, gaslighting was a constant, deadly threat. It consumed massive amounts of oxygen, making rooms incredibly stuffy and giving the occupants chronic headaches. The burning gas produced a greasy soot that ruined expensive paintings, blackened the ceilings, and killed indoor houseplants. But the real danger was the flame itself. If a window was left open and a sudden draft blew out the open flame of a gas wall sconce, the gas didn't stop flowing. There were no automatic safety shutoff valves. The toxic, highly explosive vapor would quietly fill the room while the occupants slept.
The newspapers of the Victorian era were filled with horrific, almost daily reports of devastating explosions. A homeowner would wake up in the middle of the night, smell the pungent, terrifying stench of sulfur, and do the only thing they could do in the 19th century to see in the dark. They would strike a match and light a candle to go look for the leak. The instant the open flame of the candle met the gas-filled air of the hallway, the entire house would detonate, blowing the brick facade into the street and killing everyone inside.
Furthermore, the open flames of gaslights were a massive fire hazard in public spaces. Theaters, which used incredibly bright gas flames directed through cylinders of quicklime to create the limelight for the stage, burned to the ground with terrifying regularity, often taking hundreds of lives with them. Humanity was desperate for light, but the methods we were using, hunting leviathans in the Pacific and piping explosive, toxic gas into our bedrooms, were fundamentally unsustainable and incredibly dangerous. If you are finding this hidden history fascinating, hit subscribe.
There is more lost history like this waiting to be uncovered every single week. The turning point for the human race occurred on September 4, 1882, in an unremarkable brick building in Lower Manhattan. Thomas Edison had already patented his version of the incandescent light bulb. It was a beautiful piece of engineering, a glass vacuum tube containing a carbonized bamboo filament that glowed with a brilliant, steady light when an electrical current passed through it.
It was clean, It was odorless, it consumed no oxygen, and most importantly, there was no open flame to start a fire or cause an explosion. But a light bulb is completely useless without a power source. The true engineering miracle of Thomas Edison's work was not just the bulb. It was the fact that he had to invent the entire concept of the electrical grid from scratch. On that day in September, Edison stood in the Pearl Street station and threw a massive switch.
Deep inside the building, massive coal-fired steam engines spun 6 gigantic 27-ton electrical dynamos, machines Edison had affectionately named jumbos. The dynamos generated a direct electrical current that flowed out of the building, traveling through a newly laid underground network of heavily insulated copper wires. When Edison threw the switch, the current raced through the wires beneath the cobblestones, entered the offices of his first 82 customers in the financial district, and illuminated 400 incandescent bulbs simultaneously. It was the exact moment the modern world was born.
But the transition from gas to electricity was incredibly difficult and deeply controversial. The public was absolutely terrified of electricity, and frankly, given the lack of safety regulations at the time, they had every right to be. They were being asked to allow an invisible, silent, highly lethal energy force to be wired directly into the wooden walls of their homes. When electric streetcars and incredibly high-voltage overhead arc lighting were first introduced in cities like New York, the crude, uninsulated overhead wires frequently snapped during winter storms.
They would fall into the wet streets, violently and publicly electrocuting carriage horses and pedestrians. The newspapers fed the panic, depicting electricity as a silent, creeping assassin. People genuinely believed that if you left an empty light socket turned on without a bulb in it, the electricity would leak out into the room like gas and silently suffocate them in their sleep. Many wealthy homeowners refused to install wall switches, demanding that the lights be wired to stay on permanently so they wouldn't have to touch anything physically connected to the deadly current.
This deep public fear was weaponized during the darkest chapter of electrical history, the War of the Currents. Edison, who had heavily invested his fortune and reputation in direct current, DC, found himself in a vicious corporate battle with George Westinghouse and Nikola Tesla, who championed alternating current, AC. Alternating current was vastly superior for transmitting power over long distances, but Edison feared it would destroy his business model. To prove that Tesla's AC power was dangerously lethal, Edison launched a ruthless propaganda campaign.
Edison's employees traveled the country, publicly electrocuting stray dogs, cats, and eventually horses, using alternating current to terrify the public. But the campaign reached its darkest point when Edison's camp secretly maneuvered to ensure that the newly invented electric chair, designed by the state of New York to replace hanging, was powered by a Westinghouse AC generator. Edison wanted the public to associate his rival's technology with death. He even tried to introduce a new verb into the English language, suggesting that being executed by the electric chair should be called being Westinghoused. George Westinghouse was horrified that his technology was being used as a tool for state-sponsored killing. He spent a fortune funding the legal defense of William Kemmler, an axe murderer who was slated to be the first person executed in the electric chair. Westinghouse's lawyers argued that electrocution was cruel and unusual punishment, taking the case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. They lost.
On August 6, 1890, William Kemmler was strapped into the chair. The execution was a horrific, gruesome fiasco. The initial jolt of alternating current failed to kill him, and the agonizing process had to be repeated at a higher voltage while witnesses fainted from the smell of burning flesh. Despite the sheer brutality of the War of the Currents, the undeniable superiority of the electric light eventually won. The turning point in public perception occurred at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, known as the White City.
Westinghouse and Tesla won the contract to illuminate the massive fairgrounds.
When President Grover Cleveland pushed a button, 100,000 incandescent bulbs lit up simultaneously, powered by safe, efficient alternating current. The public was mesmerized. The sheer beauty and safety of the electric light extinguished the terror of the invisible current. The butterfly effect of the electric light bulb was more profound than almost any other invention in human history. It did not just change how we see, it literally altered human biology.
Before the light bulb, human beings practiced what historians and sleep scientists call biphasic sleep, or the second sleep. Because the night was dark, dangerous, and incredibly boring, people went to bed shortly after sunset. They would sleep for a few hours, wake up around midnight, stay awake for an hour or two to read, talk, tend the fire, or pray by candlelight, and then go back to sleep for a second sleep until dawn. It was the natural, evolutionary biological rhythm of the human species. The light bulb completely eradicated the second sleep. By providing cheap, safe, artificial daylight at the flip of a switch, electricity allowed us to compress our sleep into a single, continuous 8-hour block. We extended our waking hours deep into the night. The Industrial Revolution weaponized the light bulb, using it to force laborers to work 12, 14, and 16-hour shifts in the factories, regardless of what the sun was doing outside. The 24-hour global economy, the concept of the night shift, and the entire relentless structure of modern productivity are entirely dependent on the fact that we can trick our brains into thinking the sun has never set. And in one of the greatest and most unexpected historical ironies, the light bulb accidentally performed the greatest act of animal conservation in history. The sudden availability of cheap, bright electric light utterly destroyed the market for spermaceti and whale oil. The massive whaling fleets went bankrupt, their ships rotting in the harbors of New England.
Thomas Edison, a man who just wanted to build a profitable utility monopoly and crush his rivals, inadvertently saved the whales from total extinction. Today, the massive infrastructure of light is so reliable that we only notice it when it fails. But if you look at a satellite image of the Earth taken at night from the International Space Station, you can see the ultimate physical manifestation of this engineering victory. The continents are traced in a brilliant, glowing web of gold and white light. The cities burn like massive stars against the blackness of the oceans.
The highways look like veins of glowing amber, connecting the glowing hubs of civilization. Every single point of light in that image represents a physical wire, a spinning turbine, a massive power plant, and a continuation of a war that humanity waged against the darkness for 10,000 years. We no longer need the link boys to guide us through the mud and the crime. We no longer need to extract wax from the skulls of leviathans in the middle of the Pacific. We no longer live in fear of the invisible, explosive gas filling our homes. We threw a switch and we conquered the night.
If this story changed how you look at the simplest switch in your house, subscribe to the channel. There are more hidden worlds waiting to be uncovered. Click the video on screen to see what else history left behind.